Hi, everyone. Erich Prince here, editor-in-chief of Merion West. I'm joined today by someone whom I've had the pleasure to have a number of discussions with over the past couple of years, Stephen Hicks. I'm sure folks remember, hopefully, our last conversation. So, Stephen, really good to see you again.
Thanks again, Eric, for having me back. Always enjoy our conversations.
As was sort of teased in our last discussion at the end, we promised to have a sort of follow-up on the subject of education, which is something that you've written about, and I reviewed your YouTube lecture series on education in anticipation of this conversation. So it was great to see you sort of in action with the board and going through things. So I think there's a number of topics worth touching on education. It's obviously been at the forefront of a number of people's minds, and as people at MW know, during the calendar year of 2021, I conducted a number of interviews on the subject of education, particularly in the higher education question, but also with Ann Kim on the AP exam and a number of conversations. So, Stephen, I was thinking maybe it would be interesting to first set the stage by asking you to provide something of a definition of education, because there are a number of definitions and sort of what the word education means to you.
Yeah. Well, education broadly just means the process of learning, and then when you start to unpack learning, learning is addressed to the entire human being. So we can talk about cognitive learning, emotional learning, sensory learning, physical learning. So learning in the broad sense would be developing the knowledge and the skills that one needs to function in the world. Education a little more narrowly focuses on children, and here the standout fact is that human beings start as a whole lot of potential. Of course, there's a certain amount of actuality there, but it's a striking thing for human beings is that it takes not just a few weeks or a few months or even a few years for us to become able to function in the world as adults. And so we have developed a specialty concept for what children need to develop from infancy until whatever that point is, that they are adults able to step forward into the world as fully grown adults. So the narrower concept of education focuses on that process. And so what I would say with all of that by way of framing is a definition of education in that context is the process of acquiring the knowledge, skills, and habits necessary for adult functioning in the real world.
So one of the points that you raised in that video series that I alluded to, and I encourage people watching to consider taking a look at it as well, is that education is A, expensive, and B, in human beings takes a pretty long time. So in a lot of cases, and we talked about this idea perhaps also of prolonged adolescence and such, but people are going through their education in many cases, historically, I guess, till around age 22, but these days with sort of the increased push to get a master's degree, to stand out with so many people who have an undergraduate degree, in many cases, you're sort of going through that education process into your mid-20s. There's obviously the cost of higher education, which we talk a lot about, as well as all that sort of lost earning potential if you were potentially out working. So education is, for human beings, it takes a long time, and especially in higher education, can be pretty expensive.
Yeah, so you're putting it in cost benefit terms, and I think that's certainly important because everyone recognizes that 4-year-olds are not ready to take on the world by themselves, or 15 years old. And as society gets more complicated, the amount of time to absorb the skills necessary and the knowledge necessary to absorb all of the complications might increase. As the economy gets more technical, then the amount of time necessary. So I do think, yes, we're investing time resources, we're investing dollar resources. And so the question is going to be, what's the benefit, and does the benefit outweigh the cost? And I think there's going to be a lot of different answers to that. So the bottom line is going to be that the most important time cost is the child's own time cost, because this is preparation for your life when you're a little kid. And if we are, as the education experts, the teachers and the parents and the support staff, going to make children go to school, then one thing that we absolutely have as a moral obligation is to make sure that we are not wasting the child's time in any way, shape, or form. So, to start off a little bit too early with a criticism, I do take it as a terrible indictment of the way we do most education now, that the vast majority of children going through school will report huge amounts of boredom, huge amounts of alienation. And what that is indicating is that from their perspective, this is not worth the time cost involved. And they are absolutely right. So one of the guiding costs is exactly the time cost. And if all we have, and this is much of the education establishment, is some kind of wishy-washy general aspirations that we think education should be all about, and we hold it as a kind of article of religious faith that schooling is good for you, then we're still doing a disservice if we've not operationalized that in a way to say that we are going to make good on those aspirations. We know exactly what we are doing, why we are making kids spend 18 years doing this and spending often $250,000 of other people's money in this project as well. So yes, it should be a cost-benefit analysis.
Well, Stephen, I don't want you to think that I wasn't the most attentive student, but just to your point on boredom, I recall, and with all due respect to my fourth grade teacher, Mr. Cox, but I just have the most vivid memories of being particularly in math section in fourth grade. And I would my eyes were glued to that clock of when will this end? And unfortunately, that continued in many cases, not in all my classes from my education, but sort of compared to the work I do now and such, where I'm thrilled to be doing it. And I don't have a concept of the timing. When I was in school, in a lot of cases, I was one of these bored students you're talking about.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there is a kind of a spectrum here. Students who are more active-minded, sometimes that correlates with being more intelligent or not, but just students who have an active mind, to the extent that you do two things. You tell them that you are going to tell them what they are going to learn. That is always seen by active-minded people as an imposition, as an authoritarian imposition. And it is an authoritarian imposition, and it is part of human nature. And I think it's a healthy part of human nature to resist being told what you are supposed to do. So already any model of education that goes down that road is setting its students up for tuning out just on kind of moral and political grounds as well. And the other thing is that what typically happens in mainstream schooling is this one-size-fits-all idea. Sometimes that's tied to, we are the authorities, we are the experts, we know better, we know what you need. And there are grains of truth in all of that. But if in a very mechanical fashion, that is just put on all students, that all the students are supposed to be doing the same thing at the same time in the same way, and you are not at all taking into account what students are actually interested in, then again, you are setting them up for huge amounts of boredom, because we don't actually learn anything until we are interested, at least in generic terms, in the subject. And so that has to come from the students as well. It can't come from the students. So this is still painting in broad brushes, but it is characteristic of much of mainstream schooling that you will do it because we tell you that you're going to do it, and you are going to do what we tell you to do. And both of those are profoundly antagonistic to treating human beings, children rather, as human beings who have their own interests and can and should be making their own choices. So yes, it is the active-minded who suffer the most.
Well, it's an interesting point that you raised, Stephen, about this sort of top-down approach to education and sort of the priming of sorts that must go on in the minds of the students. But I guess at the same time, this is something I often notice a lot when I was in college, where there was perhaps probably a recognition of that fact on the part of a lot of the instructors. But I guess on the flip side, and obviously there are crucial distinctions between earlier schooling and higher education, but at the same time, there was almost so much of a discussion led by the students that I felt that there was sometimes an opportunity lost, because ideally the person who's teaching, a lot of these professors, they're, as you know, you're one of them, Stephen, very versed in the subject matter, and obviously are there for a reason. They're at the head of the table for a reason. They've studied this for decades, and sometimes there was more time spent by students who knew very little about the subject matter being discussed than the teacher sort of transmitting all these decades of scholarship to the students. And it's just something I always noticed. I was thinking, I've moved to another part of the country, all this cost to go to this school just to hear someone next to me who doesn't know any more than I do telling me what I should think about it.
Right. So now we get down to particular education delivery mechanisms. And so one model is the lecture centric, where it's all professor, no student input. That has pluses and minuses. And then the others, it's all student input and no professor input, and that has pluses and minuses as well. So my answer to that is to say that there certainly is a place for a well done lecture for exactly the reasons that Erich, you just measured. I mean, professors are selected for a reason. They are supposed to be subject matter experts, and how we can get all of the knowledge from their minds into the minds of as many other people. You know, the lecture well done is an extraordinarily efficient way of doing so. So I think any sort of thoughtful education system is going to include a significant amount of lecturing. At the same time, we also know from the student perspective that we learn best when we are actively engaged with the material rather than simply passively receiving material. We listen, even if we are listening attentively, there's a proportion that we forget. That's the largest proportion, and a proportion that we retain. And all of the studies have shown that to the extent that I participate in the process verbally, in conversation, questioning, answering, and so on, the amount that I retain is greater. So all of those, again, cognitive cost-benefit calculations need to be made. Now, what I would say is let's start from higher education, because that's the example that you talked about in your circumstance. I had the same circumstance when I was in university in Canada. I recognized my professors were very smart, and I basically wanted them to lecture as much as possible because I knew my memory was pretty good and I was interested in the subject matter, so I would retain. So I remember getting intensely irritated when the professor would say, "Let's talk," and then you would have a few, several blowhard students who didn't actually know very much, pontificating about whatever, or conversation going. And so that was a huge waste of my time as well. Now, what I would say is that technology has largely solved this problem for us in the form that anything that is a commodity, and I think a professor's lecture is something that can be turned into a commodity. So I might say be a subject matter expert on Nietzsche or Aristotle or whatever, and there's no reason why I can get up in front of, say, 30 students and deliver a 1-hour very good lecture on Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Okay, that certainly is possible. But then for me to do it for another class in the next hour, and then in the next semester repeat it, same thing again, there's no reason why I cannot, with current technology, deliver that lecture, have it recorded, have it put on Vimeo, have it put on YouTube or whatever server, and it's the same, hopefully excellent lecture, but is now available to a mass audience. So there's not at the margin great value to me delivering that in person compared to delivering it say via YouTube or Vimeo. So then what that forces us to do is to say, when the professor is going to meet with the students in person, what is the unique value added to being in person? And so if delivering a canned lecture is not the unique value added, then we have to start saying it's things like personal attention, Yeah, that feeling of direct eye contact, the ability for students to interrupt with questions for clarification. And then, of course, for students to try out certain ideas and get feedback from the professor. So when we are in class, all of those are the things that we are optimizing the time spent for. And in that case, you are radically de-emphasizing lecturing. So I like the idea of what's sometimes called flipping the classroom.
I was just going to bring that up.
Yeah, so I think that's a perfect model for higher education. And what that then means is you should go in the direction of Socratic. Now, then the downside of Socratic education is what you just talked about. It's possible for the professor to just tune out, let the students go wherever, and it just turns into a rambling bull session or a rambling BS section, right, at various times.
I think most people watching will have had that experience and know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's right. So Socratic Seminar is a structured form of having guided discussions. And so the students are actively minded, the professors are actively minded. Part of the professor's job is to keep the conversation on track. And so if someone starts pontificating, to say, in effect, you are pontificating, or to ask the person to back up what they just said, and if they can't back up, then they have to shut up. And then when the conversation starts to diverge, and that's going to happen organically, for the professor to exercise judgment and say, okay, that's enough diversion, let's take things back to the main track, get the students back on track. So Socratic can be well done, but it is also as demanding to do a good Socratic discussion as it is to do a good lecture. So my ideal is a blending of those two for higher education.
Well, one of the more interesting educational experiences that I've had, and it's something that I wanted to bring up to you, is actually the first semester of my freshman year at Duke. And it was exactly that. It was flipped classroom in a class on history of medicine, history of science.
Cool.
And it was an extremely interesting educational experience. I still keep in touch with the professor, John Matthew, really brilliant guy. And it was really interesting. So that was sort of my baptism by fire of sorts of my first semester of college, having that experience. And it was very, I think I took a lot from it, and it was a really interesting class. It was almost like third grade. There were field trips almost every week to different around Duke University, to the medical center, to an herb garden.
Making all the theory concrete and particular. Now that sounds like a beautiful experience. I want to take that class now.
Yeah, it really was. The only issue, though, as you know, and as I've talked about in my essay on Elite College Reconsidered at Quillette, is that I think one of the main issues that sometimes happens at schools like Duke and Yale, where I attended, is that there's kind of so many courses going on. There's so much reading per course, and I think it can be very difficult for the students to get the maximum out of every class when they're all being taught concurrently.
Mm-hmm.
Just sort of as a practical challenge, I think that was maybe the biggest challenge that I experienced. For instance, this history of science class, I could only be so immersed in it because I had 3 other classes that also had X amount of reading, X amount of assignments, and sometimes seemed as though the instructors were operating a little bit in this sort of mindset where, okay, here's all the things I want you to do for my class, and then they're all doing this, and then before you know it, it just wouldn't be humanly possible the amount of hours a day to do all of the things.
Right.
And I've thought about, some professors were better than others at saying, why don't you read chapter 35 and half of 36? But a lot of others would just say, all right, read this book this week. And if you're taking 5 classes at Yale and you also have extracurriculars you want to be involved in and looking for jobs, it just isn't humanly possible.
Right. No, I think that's a very good point. And part of good crafting of the educational institution, and this would apply whether it's primary school, high school, university, or whatever, is being attentive to your target students' capacities. And so, one of the capacities is the number of hours per day, how much can be learned in each of those hours, and of course what the interests of the students are. So the current standard model, which is to say students will have, say, 15 hours of contact with in-class contact with professors per week. That's just going to be an average that has evolved across time. And in many cases, schools will say, well, 15 hours, that means if they're going to meet 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, for an hour, then that means you can take 5 courses. And the assumption then is that you're doing 2 or 3 hours of work outside of class for each in-class hour. So it adds up to something like a full-time week. So we do all of that math, right, and so on. But then it still is going to be an open question. If you are at more of an elite school, then you should be able to expect more of the students. If you are at an institution where you know you're attracting students who don't have the ability to retain as much information or acquire as much information at that pace, then it would be appropriate for that institution to slow things down. And the other part of what you were talking about is this issue of concentration. The idea that we should have 5 subject matters going concurrently with some trade-offs there versus 1 or 2 subjects. And it might very well be the case that we have the same amount of time, but rather than having 2, say, 16-week semesters over the course of the year, and in each of those 16-week semesters, we're going to have 5 subjects, well, maybe what we should do is have 4-week intensive units, and you just do 1 subject or 2 subjects, and you really drill down on them for 4 weeks, and then you move on to other things. All of those things are, I think, open and should be subject to ongoing experiment. I know for me, I found at least at the undergraduate level, I think it was different for me at the graduate level, that I really loved the idea of a trimester, where you would go hard at it for 10 weeks, and then have exams in the 11th week, take a week off, and then do it again. That seemed to be a sweet spot for most of my courses. And it still seems like a sweet spot, because it does strike me that many of the courses in my current institution is 16 weeks and then final exams. But I know a number of my colleagues, I won't name names, but they basically run out of steam themselves. And they spend a couple of weeks just getting warmed up, and then a couple of weeks toward the end debriefing. And then, so it ends up being just a 13-week semester anyway. It's not really a 17-week semester. Point just is, all of that should be open for experimentation and evolution.
So obviously I've always been, and people who read my articles and such know that I'm a fan of the kind of notable line from the political science John Goering, that all of public policy, it rests at least implicitly on cross-national comparisons. And obviously when we talk about higher education, some of it is a matter of public policy at certain state institutions, but kind of that detail aside, obviously, Stephen, the UK, for instance, the United States, they seem to handle higher education generally pretty differently in a number of ways. I don't know exactly how it is Canada versus the United States. Do you have a thought on sort of on the aggregate when it comes to the established ways of doing things in different countries? Who seems to be hitting it most on the head when it comes to higher.
I know there are various indexes that will rank universities all around the world, however many hundreds of them there are, and then publish the results. And as you are indicating, the universities in the United States are typically 6 or 7 of the top 10 around the world, and about 15 of the top around 20 around the world. And then there's consistently a couple from the UK, and then from Europe, Canada, right? And they get sprinkled in the mix as well. So there is a broad political question about why consistently those nations have been able to develop a flourishing higher education culture and maintain it over time. And I think despite all of our concerns about a lot of the silliness and nastiness that's going on in higher education right now, things overall are still quite healthy in the higher education sectors in United States, Canada, England, Europe, and Australia, and so forth. And I don't think the reasons for that are particularly mysterious. Anytime you have a really rich country, and all of these countries are market-friendly countries, and they're by and large open to innovation, and so that's just enormously productive of wealth. And then human beings, what they are, they want their best for their children. And so anytime people have extra money, they invest it in education. So we have the resources to invest in education. We do have a broad culture of intellectual freedom, and that does carry over into the intellectual culture inside the universities with formal academic and tenure protections, and those have also been very valuable. I think also an important part of it has been, despite what I'll call old-fashioned Platonism, that we should be like pursuing knowledge for its own sake, and we shouldn't be interested in practical applications and business and making money and so on. I think that position is kind of philosophically nonsense. And while it's paid lip service,
Stephen, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, because it's
we'll come back to that for a moment. But I think it's largely played lip service, fortunately, and the idea that we want knowledge to be practical ultimately. Of course, we're interested in theories for the sake of theories, or for aesthetic reasons, or just to know the way the world works and so on. But we also want that knowledge to improve the human condition in various ways, and that means, asking what it means for human life, asking how we can change the world and make new technologies to improve human life. So the successful universities have been very good at cultivating, for the most part, healthy relationships outside the university. And so there's a great deal of funding available for professors who are engaging in research that can feed into entrepreneurial applications, and even encouraging, in many cases, the professors to become entrepreneurs themselves once they found something useful. And so that has kind of cross-pollinated the universities with the rest of culture, and not just made it an ivory tower island unto itself. So I think that's why those universities in those countries consistently do well. And then the contrast that you're asking about at the beginning is nations that don't do that. They don't have a culture of entrepreneurism. They do still kind of prize knowledge in that Platonic sense as an abstract value into itself, or they actively disparage cross-pollination with the rest of culture. Those are the ones that have adequate or not very good universities.
So one kind of methodological point, or sort of one detail that I was thinking of, and I don't know, maybe it's not as relevant as sort of the distinction between the West broadly conceived of in terms of higher education and some of these other parts of the world, is this question of some of the precise differences between higher education in the UK versus the United States. For instance, I was going to school in the UK as well, and this idea of a course of study maybe being 3 years instead of 4, or a greater focus on, and this is why I thought of it, Stephen, because you're talking about sort of narrowing in on a particular area of study, saying, I'm doing my degree in history, and I'm going to predominantly be studying history, and I'm not going to get overly sidetracked with the whole course or sort of core curriculum type ideas. And maybe we're kind of splitting hairs, but I'm wondering if there's
I think all of that's great, but I think the difference there is the kind of student whom one is talking about. I think there's a kind of student for whom an almost hands-off kind of education is appropriate. The student knows what he or she wants to do, is active-minded, has self-discipline and the right motivation, and they just go ahead and do whatever they do. And then they have meetings once in a while with their professors, and that can be perfectly fine. And something close to the tutorial model that is quite well established at institutions like Oxford and Cambridge, famously, that works beautifully for that kind of student as well. I think other kinds of students are more social, and so they do in fact learn better from discussion. Just give them a list of books and YouTube lectures to listen to, it won't really happen for them. On the other hand, if they are with a bunch of other students who are throwing out ideas, that their way of learning is through throwing out some ideas and getting feedback on it and trying this, that, and the other thing. So a more regularly social form of education can be appropriate. And so the best model of that, I think, is the liberal arts education, small liberal arts college education model in the United States. So experimenting along all of those dimensions and allowing students the freedom to choose the model of education that works for them is going to be the best.
And this intersects with a topic that I wanted to ask you about as we discussed beforehand, which is this question of being an autodidact versus going to a university. And obviously part of universities is about credentials. It's about signaling that you're able to complete a course of study. But that's that question. And if you remember in the movie Good Will Hunting, when Will says to the fellow in the bar, you just dropped 150 grand education I got from $1 of late fees at the local library. And even for me personally, I never learned more than during about an 8 to 9 month period where I just by myself read books. And this question of how far does being sort of an autodidact go, and maybe that is good for some people, but it can't be sort of extrapolated as a matter of public policy. Or
no, absolutely not as public policy. And even setting aside the political delivery of education, it still can't be extrapolated. At this point, it has to become customized very quickly. It's a bit like saying, should you have one very good friend who's extraordinarily intimate with you and you spend the bulk of your leisure time with that person, or should you have 3 pretty good friends, all of whom are close and you alternate them, or should you have a broad social circle of 8 or 10 people? You have your soccer buddies and your bowling buddies and your chess buddies and go to the movie buddies, right? So there's no such thing as a right answer to that question. Each individual has to discover that for himself or herself.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So Stephen, I want to ask you a little bit more about what you brought up before, this perception that education, when geared toward practicality, there's some sort of stigma associated with it. And I could say that I think part of, for instance, at Yale College, which is probably the institution I know best, obviously you couldn't major in marketing. And not only that, I remember on the first day of microeconomics, Professor Stephen Barry basically saying something to the effect of, this is a theoretical class. If you're looking to glean something from this to apply in your job in the financial industry, you're wasting your time. This is a liberal arts school, and which is a little different than Duke, which had some more kind of practical majors that did exist. They weren't the majority, but they did sort of exist, where the focus there was really kind of on the theory, and there was almost a tinge of, don't try to focus on the practicality right now. That's almost kind of bit us to think that way.
Yeah.
Gauche.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things that are going on there. One thing is a legitimate possibility to say knowledge is complex, and we're going to divide up knowledge into various specialties. Of course, those specialties have to be coordinated again. The biologists and the chemists have to do their own thing, but then there also needs to be biochemistry that integrates the two. To say that, yes, so there's all this complexity and all of these specialties, and I, in this overall division of the intellectual labor, am only really interested in this area, and that's what I wanted to focus on. That's okay, as long as you make that clear. But it's different to say, I am only interested in this, and this is the only important thing in the universe for everybody, and everything else is crap. And many people in the intellectual world will take that sort of position as well. So they will say, for example, the classics are important, modern languages don't really matter. And sometimes it actually goes the other way as well. Have marketing professors know to say marketing is the thing that really matters, and the rest is just making widgets. This is where all of the interesting creativity is, and all of that history and literature is just completely pointless. So that's one dimension. The Platonism I was mentioning earlier was the idea that in principle, knowledge should be divorced from any sort of practicality, that we want things to be pure, and that if we are interested in taking knowledge and applying it, then we are sullying it or making it impure in various ways. And this has a long, long tradition in the West. It still is one of the great battles within higher education. So do we pursue knowledge for its own sake, or do we pursue knowledge ultimately with the idea that it's going to be practical, that it's going to make a difference in human lives? And that's a big philosophical divide broadly between Platonists and Aristotelians, or sometimes it gets tied in with religious traditional histories as well. It doesn't have to be, but there is a kind of position that wants to say, the mind is part of the soul, right, and or the spirit, and that's a completely different thing from the body or the physicality, and we need to keep them separated from each other. And that if you are a good person, then you are just interested in the development of your soul. You don't pay very much attention to your body. And that's a cartoon version of a position that then has some far-reaching implications if you take it fully seriously. So knowledge resides in the mind, and it really shouldn't have anything to do with the body or physicality. And that one still is with us to a large extent in higher education.
So Stephen, you were saying a little bit about this sort of stigma sorts that can be associated with education that is geared towards more practical matters such as employment, or kind of looking beyond the sort of university walls itself to what comes after.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's a stigma that goes both ways. I mean, absolutely, in Western intellectual history, although more broadly, there is this kind of mind-body dichotomy, right, or purity versus practicality dichotomy, and it cuts both ways. Now, for the longest time, the bias was against practical education or any sort of applied education, and so the idea was that education should be pure in the sense that it should be abstract, general, that we're not interested in working with our hands or making money, and all of those things are seen as being not of the mind, but of the body, of the lower physical world. And so that has been baked into intellectual and cultural life for many centuries. Of course, as we got into the modern world, that got challenged, and challenged successfully. And if you think of a philosopher like Francis Bacon, with his famous line that knowledge is power. The whole idea of acquiring knowledge is that we're supposed to empower people to be able to make a difference in their lives and in the world, and improve the world more broadly. It's not just this abstracted ivory tower thing. So mostly liberal education has been the idea that we want to integrate those two somehow. But nonetheless, the bias against any sort of physical education, career training, making money still is a substantial part of higher education, and to a lesser extent, lower education. Of course, it also goes the other way. The practical side of the equation has made great inroads over the course of the last century, with the success of the business world, the success of engineering, the success of medical practice, and so on, to the extent that in many cases, professors and educators in those fields will say, we need to be applied, to be a practical, none of this well-rounded person nonsense or high theory academic. We're not in the ivory tower. We're preparing people for work, and that means a much more narrower applied focus. So in my view, both of those sides of the dichotomy are false. And a good liberal education will be educating the mind and educating the body, a sound mind in a sound body, the way the classic line puts it.
So, as a lot of people have sort of observed in recent years, perhaps as a reaction against the increasing costs of a lot of higher education and such, there's been various entrants, so to speak, in the space, whether it's Coursera, whether it's Yale open courses, that have sort of had this idea of transmitting the knowledge directly to people. At this point, not necessarily in lieu of the university experience, but also kind of with this broader question of, is going to a university in our society today, is it primarily about the education itself, or is it primarily about a sort of credentialism? And
Yes.
some of these proposed alternatives, which have, I think, experienced differing amounts of success, have experimented with offering certificates and things like that.
Yeah.
You know, there are various companies such as Google and such that are coming in and saying, okay, you can have this certificate for this type of skill and such. And how do you see this potential push? Do you see it having success? How do you see it fitting into sort of the educational ecosystem we have today?
All of that, I think, is a beautiful thing. And while we're all concerned about education, and there's a lot of gnashing of teeth and pulling of hair, much of it justified. There are a lot of very worrying things going on in all sectors of education. At the same time, I think when the histories are written of our era, it will be seen as a golden age of experimentalism. Just because the various quasi-monopolies of the last century, they are, everybody has recognized that they have underperformed for at least 2 generations, but there's been a huge amount of goodwill and benevolence and benefit of the doubt extended to them over the course of the last 2 generations. But I think that is finally, people's patience is wearing thin, particularly when we see some of the obnoxious and anti-education things that are going on. The even huger mismanagement of resources and outright waste of resources we are spending in every generation, again, out of goodwill. Yes, we underperformed last time. We just need to have more money, so we give them more money. All right, and then, a generation later, we underperform. It's a budget crunch. So I think all of that is wearing thin. At the same time, we have a lot more savvy consumers who are aware of alternatives that are out there. We have the technologies that have come along in the last generation that are stupendous. And then we have educators and entrepreneurs who are interested in exploring this space. So there are 1,000 ways of packaging, repackaging existing education reforms going on inside the traditional systems, people building brand new education platforms. And so out of this literally thousands of educational projects, we don't know which ones are going to succeed, but substantial reform will occur. I'm convinced of that. And the way it always goes, the 10 out of 1,000 entrepreneurial ideas that are amazing, we'll find out what those are, and they will be the ones that dominate next generation.
Well, that's exactly right, Stephen. I know you're a big believer in entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurial spirit and sort of the churn created by capitalism and the free exchange of ideas and work. And I think it's a sort of an optimistic portrait you've painted about how these can help to either supplant in some cases or just improve the educational ecosystem.
Yeah, great. Yeah, for sure. I'm only sad that it's taken the waste of millions of young people's childhoods substantially, because much of mainstream education literally is dehumanizing. You see the light going out of their eyes fairly early on, and that they know every day they're going in for 6 hours of whatever, and that's just it's a tragedy. So I applaud those parents who are showing up at school boards and doing something about it. Those parents who are giving unschooling and homeschooling a go. Those who are working extra jobs and cutting back on various luxuries in order to send their kids to private schools. Those parents are heroes to their children. I mean, they're doing what good parents should be doing, but unfortunately, they've not been able to rely on the institutions that made promises to them, and so they're having to do double duty in this generation to make up for the deficits of the formal education system.
So just to close, Stephen, I know that education is something that you have worked on for a long time. As I mentioned earlier, I watched your video series that you recorded several years ago about various approaches to education. So for fans of yours and people who follow your work, do you have a preview of anything next that's coming on your work in education?
Yes, well, yeah, thanks for the plug. Yeah, my philosophy of education course is online at the CEE video channel, and that's a course that I started teaching at my university for some years to aspiring teachers, but then we recorded it and put it online. What I'm working on right now is a book called 8 Philosophies of Education. Right now we have a hodgepodge of inconsistent philosophies of education, all of them operative in the schools. And so one of the reasons everything is such a mess is not just the politicization of the process, but just genuine disagreements by thoughtful people about what real education is. But because we have such a complicated civilization with people from all over the world and a lot of freedom to try out different ideas, and education and life is hard, we do have thoughtful but dramatically different ideas about what education should be. So I'm working on the 8 most prominent philosophies that are currently operative in the schools, what the arguments and rationales and institutionalizations for those are.
Well, I'm glad you got a chance to kind of tease everyone of what's next, and you got a chance to do that. So, Stephen, thank you so much for joining me. I always, as everyone knows, I always really enjoy our conversations. So
always a pleasure, Eric. You've got your finger on many pulses.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So great to see you, Stephen, and thanks again for talking about in my view, a very important topic, education. So
Great.
See you later,
Stephen. Bye for now.